There we go. Okay. Uh, so we are right over here, and um, the Ottomans controlled um, a tremendous. They controlled Israel for this was already like 400 years that they've been here. They've been here a while, but then they were starting to die, and they didn't have as much control for various reasons. But whatever it was, they were losing a little bit of power. What ended up happening was, okay, so we said over here, this is 1914, okay? This is the beginning of the war, World War One. And then by the end of the war, um, World War One had a lot to do with this because the winners of the war were basically going to be getting, land. They were going to get their booty. And as a result of the war, what ended up happening was that the British and the French were the ones that really separated the land within each other. And and we have over here the British. The British got the Israel in 1918, and before I'm going to actually say what they did, I'm going to just say that during the war, 1916, they were already discussing their booty. Okay, and this is called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and they were discussing what areas of land they would get. The British were going to get the B zone, the French were going to get the A zone. The blue zone was direct French control. This was French influence. Again, it was a little bit vague. It didn't end up panning out, but this was the beginning of the discussions of getting Palestine, of who is going to get Palestine. Okay. Because again, the Ottomans were a dying man. So they knew they were going to win. The question was, who is going to get all that booty? And then again, ultimately, the winners were the British and the French. They got, the land that they got. The French got Syria, they got Lebanon, the British got Palestine. Okay, and then we have something called the San Remo Conference, which happened in 1920, and that was when the British actually got the mandate to rule Palestine. But they didn't just get Palestine, Israel. They didn't just get this part, they also got all this and they got this as well. Okay, this was all British owned, and that's what the result of the mandate was, is that they're not going to actually um, uh, they're not going to actually rule it, but that this is going to be like a colony of theirs, basically. That was how it initially started. Then, with time, that was the San Remo Conference, and basically what it ended up looking like for us is this. Okay, this is what the British mandate was in 1917, and then in 1920, this is what we ultimately got. The British. Then there started to be some politics. The British, as much as they enjoyed the fact that they won the war, they didn't have a lot of money, they didn't have a lot of manpower, so they ended up uh, letting this go, basically. They said, like, you know what? It'll be an emirate for us. We're gonna, any decision that you make, you have to consult with us, basically. And they sort of let this Trans-Jordan part go. So the British didn't really have much to do with this area of land. This was the area that they controlled, okay, or they had a mandate for. They at this point it was not. First it was a mandate, and then they controlled it at 1920 already. Okay, so that was basically how the British got into Israel to begin with. And then we have the British ruling this land from 1920 all the way until 48 when we got our independence. But until then, there were some things that happened. The first thing that happened was the Peel Commission. And a lot of this was the result of all the fighting that was going on between the Arabs and the Jews. Specifically, and I'm going to show you soon, there were Arab riots. And so we have the Peel Commission, which was British man named Lord Peel who decided he's going to make peace between the Arabs and the Jews. And what's he going to do? This part is going to be Jewish. Because why? This is where most of the Jews were living. That's where they were being in, that's where the land of Israel was inhabited. This part is going to be Arab, and this part is going to be British. Okay? Under British control, and they're going to still retain that control. That was his proposal. The Arabs were very unhappy about it, and the Jews were happy because at least it was something. They were getting something. Till now, they weren't being recognized for anything. So whatever land they would be getting, they were happy. While this was all happening, again, this is 1937. So between 36 and 39, we had something called the Tower and Stockade communities. And it's a fascinating idea. Basically, what would happen is that people would, there was a law in the times of the British that if something had a roof over its head, it was a community, it was an actual building, you weren't allowed to knock it down. So the British were like, the Jews were saying, okay, we could build communities, but they couldn't allow the British to see it. So overnight, they would, while it was dark, literally, 6 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning, they would put up an entire community. And what they would do is this was the tower that they would put, they had like a whole method of how they would do it. And there are places, there's an actual museum if you want to go see it. It's by Gan HaShlosha. It's beautiful, and it's really amazing to see how they worked together to create these communities. Okay, this was the roof, they had tents, and but they had like a wall surrounding it as well, and they would build these communities. And we're going to see later on how these communities really helped us later on in the UN partition plan in 1949. And I'm going to show you that later. But in the meantime, just know that from 1936 to 1939, we were creating these tower and stockade communities. Okay. Hold on. Someone else just joined, but I can't see them. Here. Okay. Hi, Tara. Welcome. So, okay. So we have these tower and stockade communities going on on the Jewish side. And then on the Arab side, they were angry because of this 37 Peel Commission that was created, and they started to revolt. So between 1936 and 1939, there were revolts going on in different places in Israel, in Jaffa, in Jerusalem. It was just, they were revolting because of the anger that they had, that there were Jews that were coming to Israel. So another thing that happened at this time was that the British saw that they were revolting and they wanted to appease them. So they started creating quotas for how many Jews were allowed to come to Israel. And there were, they would make X amount that were allowed to come. And therefore, that's why people that say, like there was one lady that was telling me that her grandmother tried to come to Israel, and she was turned back because the British, it wasn't that the Arabs weren't allowing her, it was the British that weren't allowing her mother to go in because there were quotas and they didn't want to, make any conflict between the Arabs and the Jews over here. So any additional Jews was creating more conflict for them, and therefore they sent many Jews back. There are like, very famous boats that went back because the British sent them back. So that was between 36 and 39. And throughout there was a lot of friction and there was a tremendous amount of hostility. But it wasn't even like the British were against the Jews or against the Arabs. The British were out for themselves. That's what they were there for. It was like there was one general that said, somebody asked him, I thought you're on the British side. An Arab said that. I thought you were on the Jewish side. And then the Jews would say, I thought you were on the Arab side. And he would be like, that's exactly what we wanted. We wanted each side to think that we were on the other side because we didn't want them to know whose side we were on. They literally played both sides. That's what the British were when they ruled this country. And it was very, very difficult because we didn't have autonomy. And also what they did was it would sort of pit the Arabs against the Jews. And people say till today, there are like very, big professors and all the people that study the history of Israel really believe that a lot of this conflict between the Arabs and the Jews are coming from the British. It all started then, and then like when there's a conflict and then it escalates and then you're like, you don't even know why it started, because you're thinking about the thing that happened last week. It really did start with the British, a lot of this conflict, because they were trying to appease the Arabs and they were trying to appease the Jews, and they couldn't appease anyone, and therefore everybody was angry at them. So that was really a lot of what happened with the British being here in Israel. Tara, I can review some of the other things later in the what I went over in the beginning. Maybe you'll get more context. So what ended up happening was in 1946, we have something called the Morrison-Grady Plan, which Morrison was a Brit and Grady was an American, and they were going to try to create some peace between the two. And what their idea was is that this over here, this N, we call it the N, is going to be Arab. This N is going to be Jewish. This green is going to be Arab, and this over here is going to be British. So again, they wanted to make this partition between the three of them. What's interesting is, remember I spoke to you about the tower and stockade communities. The reason why they actually separated the land like this is because wherever there were Jews living there, that's where they gave land. So we have over here, there were Jewish communities such as tower and stockade communities, and therefore all of this ended up going to the Jews because they had people inhabiting the land over there. And then, so that was in 1946. It did not end up panning out, but we had something similar in 1947. And that's really where the breaking point happened. In November 29th, 1947, the United Nations came and said, we're going to finally make peace between the two. We're going to do something called the Partition Plan. And the Partition Plan is where we have, this is going to be Jewish, all of this will be Jewish, and all of the yellow will be Arab. Okay. And the Jews were really happy with this idea because it was the first time that anyone ever acknowledged that this was their land. Okay. This was like the first time that like somebody openly gave them the rights and the ability to have their own land. The Arabs were not, even though they weren't getting the whole land, at least they got something. And the Arabs were very upset. They did not like it, and therefore that was the beginning of the civil war of independence, basically. The Arabs against the Jews who were angry about this partition plan. And now we're going to actually go into this war of 1948 and see what the Civil War actually was. So we have over here, going on in the north, all the battles going on up north, the battles going on down south, and then over here, and I took a group over here. You see this little line here? This is Kvish Echad from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. That's road 1. Okay. And you can actually see, I'll show you on Google Maps what it actually looks like. Kvish Echad. And let's see here.
Are we talking about near where the fires are right now? Highway 1?
You know what? Yes. Yes, that is exactly where it is. Yeah, I actually was thinking that. I was like, where I feel and somebody was saying like I feel like we're back to October 7th when he was like, seeing if there were cars that were abandoned there. But oh wow, this is really out. But what's interesting, why is this not going? Let's do this again. Um, it's very interesting to see what went on in in 1948. I'm on a Mac and it's just it's not my thing. I'm like used to my iPad, you know? Okay, Jerusalem wildfires here. You see it? Oh, that's funny. Okay, so from Jerusalem all the way to Tel Aviv, you have Kvish Echad, and you had like three very important points. The Zoom will end in 10 minutes. Okay, so we're gonna reconvene in 10 minutes. I'll send you another link. Um, we have over here the it was Nebi Samuel, which was a very important area. We have Castell, which I take people to, and they have a whole, they talk about what the actual battle was. But there were three very important points over here that the IDF, which, at the time had to contend with in order to deal with the war. Basically, on the road from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv was they would shoot people that were going on that road. And what happened was Jerusalem didn't have any agriculture of their own. They didn't grow anything. They were reliant on all the people on the coast for all the food and supplies. So in order to get food and supplies, they needed to bring it to Jerusalem. But when they would travel to Jerusalem, they would shoot them in their cars. And there were many casualties as a result. And if you go on Route 1 till today, they have like three like sort of cars or convoys, we call them. And they were like a reminder of the Battle of the Roads over there. And people really died over there. In the end, ultimately, they ended up just building another road. If you notice, you'll see a road called Burma Road that was built to bypass this, Road 1 that was being ambushed by the Arabs at the time. So, so yeah, so that was just one of the battles that we were dealing with then. There were many, many more, but this is just something that you actually see because it was literally on, right in our backyard. That was the battle that was happening. Versus these where, you weren't as prone to seeing as much. Okay. Ultimately, we ended up, that was a Battle of the Roads. Ultimately, they lost. The Arabs at the time ended up losing the war, the civil war, and then we ended up at literally the day after, which was May 14th, because what happened? The British said, okay, there was a civil war going on. We're here, we're trying to control this country. We want to make money off of this. We're not making any money when there's a war going on. So they're like, you know what? We're leaving. So on May 14th, 1948, the British left Israel. And that was an amazing day for Israel because the British finally left and everybody was thrilled. Everybody was so happy. They ended up making a whole ceremony in Independence Hall in Tel Aviv, and you have a museum that's not really ready yet because it's under renovation, but they signed the Declaration of Independence. Finally, they are free from the British. Okay. So that was May 14th, 1948. And that's really what we're celebrating tomorrow, the independence from the British, who finally left and caused us a lot of problems. Except after the British left, now there's a vacuum. Now there's a power vacuum. So who's going to come in? And therefore, we had five Arab nations that all came in at the same time to try to take over. They were Syria here on top, Iraq, Jordan over here, okay, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and then Egypt on the bottom. Five Arab nations coming in and trying to attack us the next day after we got our independence from the British. So the Civil War lasted for, a number of months, but then we have to contend with the rest of the nations surrounding us. And finally, we ended up that we were able to handle all of those five nations. And thank God we ended up making a peace treaty between us and Jordan specifically. Jordan is over here. We agreed that Jordan can get this, but the ceasefire line is going to be over here. And the famous story is that they took a green pencil and they, marked exactly where we're going to get that land. And that green pencil is a few millimeters thick. So what happened to the area of the pencil? Do you know? Okay, that area is called no man's land. It was nobody's. They didn't think of it. It was like they drew the map, they took a pencil, they didn't realize how thick the pencil was. And that area in real life,
It got blurred.
what? What'd you say? That area in real life. What'd you say, Tara? I don't know. Maybe she was talking to someone else.
I was saying it got blurred.
Oh, you got blurred. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
So that's all. No, I'm saying I feel like the line got blurred.
Oh, the line got
Like you
blurred.
couldn't figure it out where
100%.
exactly it was.
100%. And not only that, but on the map, it's a certain thickness on the paper, it's a certain thickness, but they didn't take into account the actual land. Okay. So if you come to Israel and if you came to Israel between 48 and 67, you will see the areas. I can take you to areas that are actually no man's land. And then there's the famous story of the nun who dropped her dentures onto the no man's land and she wasn't able to go because it wasn't an Israeli land, but then it wasn't Jordan land. So they ended up having to convene with the UN to decide if she can get her dentures. Okay. And this is right outside Sahel Square. And then there's another house where she wanted to build a bathroom, but it was also in between. Half of his house was in the Jordanian side and half of it was on the Israeli side. So it was like done in a very Israeli style, as we like to say. And there's a lot of very funny stories that happened as a result. Some of them say that the Jordanians and the Israelis ended up becoming friends with each other because they were so close to each other, so they would be able to, but they weren't allowed into that no man's land. There were soldiers there always protecting. So definitely a very interesting period in our history between 48 and 67. And there's a lot to see at the time. There was also a cable car going from, they weren't able to go, let's say if you go on the Mount of Olives, to the other side by the Menachem Begin Center, that area was no man's land. It was the Hinnom Valley. So they had a cable car that would go above to bring supplies, because they weren't allowed to go into the land. So they had it above or below. They had a tunnel going underneath the Mount Zion tunnel, it's called. So yeah, definitely a lot to talk about over there. And it's very fun. So this is that green line that we're talking about and the no man's land that happened at the time. Okay. And then we have the 67 war where we finally were able to win back all of the territory that we lost. And we didn't have any of those issues anymore. The Gaza Strip, we weren't able to win back, but we were able to get back the West Bank after 67 and also parts of the Golan Heights. Okay. Golan Heights and the West Bank we got, except
Shiva,
yeah.
My understanding was that Israel was actually given the Gaza, but then they let it go to make peace.
So that was not, so yes, you are correct about that, but it wasn't Gaza, it was the Sinai. So we received the Golan Heights in 67, together with the West Bank, as well as this whole Sinai Peninsula. We fought for this. And then I'm going to say later on that this we literally just relinquished. because, well, I wouldn't say that we just relinquished it. There was a a thought process in his head, but he did relinquish this whole piece of land, the Sinai, which we did win in 67. And we're still paying the price for that, for this whole thing, because the Gaza Strip over here, I'm sorry, is connected. We could have had more control over Gaza if we would have had the Sinai Peninsula.